Look, I'm conscious of the fact, and I got some criticism from Deputy Crowe for not giving more detail earlier, and that was because I was very anxious to let some of my colleagues in, and we had a tight speaking slot earlier. I have a few minutes now, so I'd like to maybe respond to some of the concerns that were outlined earlier by colleagues here. The first thing that I want to say, just in terms of the politics of this Dáil, I want to thank all parties for their patience and their cooperation on what has been quite a testing period in terms of Brexit negotiations and the intensification in recent months and weeks of no-deal Brexit contingency planning. I want to say that, I have heard both outside of this House and today in this House some frustration from colleagues opposite that they're not getting enough information or enough detail quickly enough. I mean this when I say it. If people have a genuine concern, if people want information or briefings, if you contact my office, you'll get them straight away if we have them. And in particular with Fianna Fáil, I think that relationship is very important, but also with Sinn Féin and others. That is why I made a point after the Cabinet meeting on Tuesday of briefing Fianna Fáil as the main opposition party, then briefing others before we gave anything to the media. And that is what we will try to continue to do. This isn't a political game. This isn't about the government trying to look good and taking tough positions on Brexit. This is about a national interest here. And we might be in government in a year's time, it could be somebody else. There are core issues that we need to be careful that we protect and defend. In many ways, what we are witnessing here and what we are part of is history unfolding week by week before our eyes in terms of our relationship with our closest neighbour and in terms of the United Kingdom's relationship with the EU. And decisions will be taken in the coming weeks and months which will change the direction of that relationship. And we need to work together to make sure that through that process, the priorities that I think we all have, which is to try to maintain the closest possible relationship with the United Kingdom, to try to protect core Irish interests, to try to protect our businesses and our farmers and our fishermen, to try to protect our Irish citizens in Britain and indeed across the United Kingdom, in Northern Ireland, and to try to protect a peace process and the progress that's been made in the last 20 years, in particular reinforced by the absence of any physical border infrastructure as an impediment to the free movement of people or goods or anything else for that matter. They're the priorities that I've outlined many times. We are unfortunately in a position now where we still, close to 70 days to go, we still don't know what a majority in the British Parliament want. And that has made preparation across the European Union, but in Ireland in particular, because of our exposure and vulnerability to Brexit and its fallout, difficult to plan for. And we are planning for all eventualities across all sectors. We're working in a collaborative way with industry, with trade unions, with representative organisations for different sectors, and with other political parties. And when I hear accusations that we're not open about that, when actually, I've faced down other people who suggested that we shouldn't have had, for example, opposition political parties in our stakeholders group. And I insisted from the very start that we should have everybody who wants to be there in terms of political groups and parties. I think that's been the right decision. And it's helped, actually, to create consensus. And every now and again we have different approaches. I've been critical, for example, of Sinn Féin's position in relation to having a debate on a border poll in the midst of all of this. I don't think that's helpful, and I think it has added a lot of tension and polarisation to the debate in Northern Ireland. But I respect everybody in Northern Ireland has a right to dream and aspire to a kind of future that they believe they want for themselves and their family, whether you're a nationalist or a unionist. And I have my own views on that. But what we're trying to do right now is protect the status quo so that we can create some stability to be able to have debates like that in the future in a non-heated environment. And we have enough challenges right now to overcome. in an atmosphere where we don't have devolved government, where we don't have north-south structures, where we effectively don't have a functioning Good Friday Agreement in terms of its structures, that to add the pressure of a very divisive and difficult and emotive debate, which creates huge fears amongst some communities, at a time when we're trying to get compromise on both sides to find a way forward on Brexit, both in London and in Belfast. But having said that, I have to say, to Sinn Féin's credit, they have not made life difficult for me at times when we've had to plan to get things done, despite the fact that we have different perspectives on certain approaches. So I just want to recognise that, and I want to say, because I mean it, the next few weeks are going to be very challenging for Ireland, and we need to work together, unlike what's happening in Westminster, where the two main parties are refusing to even talk to each other without preconditions, despite the fact that their country is rolling towards a cliff edge. It's unbelievable. And I say that because my country is being impacted by their inability to talk to each other in terms of no-deal Brexit planning, and of course all of the stress and strife and fears and rumours that will be filtering through communities in border counties in Ireland, wondering what's going to happen, and so on. And so I hope we will see mature politics developing and a middle ground emerge within Westminster that puts this issue of a no-deal Brexit to bed as soon as is possible. But that is a matter for Britain and Westminster. Unfortunately, we have to deal with the consequences, but they are a sovereign parliament and they need to make decisions in the ways that they do. In terms of what we can do here, we can continue to prepare for worst-case scenario, which we are. I don't accept, actually, the sort of glib criticism that the document that we published in December didn't have any detail in it. Actually, there's a lot of detail in that document. If anybody wants to sit down with me for a few hours and go through it section by section, I'll point out the detail to you. But there are parts of that document that are light. That is true, because there are certain things that don't have contingency plans yet. Some of those areas are EU competence, so we can't do it even if we want to. There are certain areas where the EU has yet to decide how they would deal and approach the consequences of a no-deal Brexit. Fishing, for example, is a good example to that. Hugely complex. And so, you know, people may call for answers, assuming that I have them in a briefcase somewhere, and I'm not giving them out. This is an evolving process. What we published in December was essentially a framework document for dealing with contingency planning. It deals with 20 different sectoral areas. What we did in the Cabinet meeting this week is in 4 of those areas we provided a lot more detail to Cabinet and gave initial briefings to opposition parties, but we probably need to give more detailed briefings on that, in the area of how we're going to deliver on the CTA, so that Irish citizens and British citizens in each other's countries in the future will be able to enjoy the kind of privileges that they enjoy today. Because that was there long before either of us joined the European Union, and it's going to be there long after Britain leaves. We did it in relation to medicines, because I know, and Simon Harris knows, that this is a sensitive area and we need to reassure people. And that's why we wanted to prioritise it and do it early in January. And there isn't any medicines that are on a risk list that actually we are predicting won't be available post-Brexit. There aren't. But of course, that could develop. And we have a team of people working on that. In fact, there's been conversations going on that issue for 2 years between the HSE and the other relevant stakeholders and bodies. And I have to say, Simon Harris's memo to government this week was pretty convincing and persuasive. That actually, while there's work to do here, undoubtedly, we don't have anything fundamental to worry about. We did it also in relation to legislation, which is where we've had sort of probably the longest element of the briefing we had the other day, where we are going to have to introduce essentially 17 bills in one piece of omnibus legislation. And we're going to have to do it before the middle of March, just in case I think it's unlikely, as I've said before, but just in case Britain crashes out on the 29th, just in case the British political system is unable to deal with this issue, and it happens almost by default, it's possible but unlikely. So we have to plan for it. And we will be ready, from a legislative point of view, with your help. And we will be totally open about this legislation with you. Next week, hopefully, we'll be able to publish the heads of that piece of legislation, which, as I say, has 17 different sections in different areas. I think it's 9 different government departments, Angela, is that right? And 17 different sections. And we will have another 28 secondary pieces of legislation then in relation to ministerial orders and statutory instruments. And again, we'll go through that in detail with anybody who's interested. So please don't sort of put this accusation out that there's no detail going on here. Like, we have itemised 28 statutory instruments that are required to potentially be introduced over the next few weeks, and we have 17 different sectoral areas within one omnibus piece of legislation, the heads of which will be hopefully ready for Cabinet next week, but certainly be hopefully published by the end of next week. And then going to parliamentary draft people to draft one of the biggest pieces of legislation that this House may ever have passed, to be ready to publish it on the 22nd of February, so that then we can take it in to second stage in this House, debate it, and agree procedures with the opposition. This isn't about big parties dominating or anything like that. Agree procedures so that we can get this thing done, if we have to protect our country. And again, I have to say, from my initial discussions, people could not have been more cooperative in terms of wanting to help us get that done on time, in a way that allows us to effectively pass legislation to protect the status quo for our citizens in different areas. In terms of the backstop, I mean, a number of valid questions, but can I just say that this assumption that if there's a no-deal Brexit, because we have an obligation to protect the EU single market and customs union, which we do, we will somehow just be forced by default to reintroduce border infrastructure. I don't accept that premise, because when it comes to the border, we have competing responsibilities towards a peace process, towards peaceful relationships, towards an all-island economy, as well as EU membership. And that is understood in London and in Brussels. But that does not mean that the narrative that we sometimes hear from Brexiteers, that Dublin doesn't want this, London doesn't want this, Brussels doesn't want this, so what are we worrying about? There'll be no border. That is a bogus argument, because to simply assume that it won't happen because you don't want it to doesn't actually deliver what we need. What's needed is a legal agreement that provides that guarantee that no physical border infrastructure will re-emerge as an unintended consequence of Brexit in a no-deal scenario or in a planned scenario. And there's an obligation on the British government, just like there's an obligation on the Irish government as co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, to ensure that we plan for that, even in a no-deal Brexit scenario. And some of the language that the British Prime Minister has used around, in all circumstances, we have an obligation to avoid hard border infrastructure. What the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has said, deal or no deal, we have to prevent border infrastructure on the island of Ireland. And so we will need to be mature enough to ensure that there is contingency planning in place, should it be necessary, to prevent border infrastructure, even in a no-deal Brexit scenario. But that, of course, will be challenging, should it happen. And that is why we remain a strong advocate of the backstop as a mechanism to provide the guarantees that we need, which is an approach that the British government supported, as well as the Irish government, as well as 26 other EU member states. And we will continue to advocate for that, as in my view will Michel Barnier and President Tusk and President Juncker. There is strong solidarity on this issue, and I don't see that dissipating anytime soon, because it's the right argument. And those who argue against the backstop, which essentially is about dealing with border infrastructure through regulatory alignment in the areas necessary to ensure that you don't need border infrastructure. is a very different approach to this issue than some who seem to think that you can deal with it through technology or slick camera systems or whatever, which I think is not a credible argument, if people are honest. So that is the context of any of the comments that I've been quoted as making this week, and it is the government's position, which I think was firmly put by the Taoiseach as well here on Tuesday. Finally, can I just say that, that we do need to show some patience over the next few days. Ireland needs to hold its nerve. I've said that a number of times this week. While we are impatient for answers and impatient for solutions that need to come from London, we will, unfortunately, because of the pace at which those solutions, I hope, will be put together and agreed, we will have to show some patience in terms of the political solutions, because we can't solve this problem, or we can't contribute to the solving of this problem, until we know what a majority of people in Westminster actually want and will vote for. And so in the meantime, we need to focus on what we do control, which is contingency planning, both with the Commission and the contingency planning that we need to do for ourselves. And that's what you'll see a big focus on next week from the government, as we move towards publishing heads of legislation that I hope won't be needed, but we need to prepare for in the weeks ahead.
Thank you, Tánaiste.